So we've talked so far about realist theory and about liberal theory, and these are the two major approaches that we're going to be using over the course of this class. However, there are other ways of thinking about the international system that are introduced in Goldstein and Peephouse and are maybe worth spending a little time sort of highlighting and talking through. The first of these is Marxist theory, right, which is something that we're going to come back to when we talk about the global economy and when we talk about inequality in the global economy. But thus, at this point, I think it's maybe useful to kind of talk briefly about what goes into sort of a Marxist theory of international politics. And I want to make a quick note before we talk about this, that oftentimes there's a sense that Marxist theory is not necessarily relevant because the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed. And I think that's a misreading of Marxist theory. That Marx and others who've applied his thinking have really provided some important insights into how the international system operates. And even if the Soviet Union isn't there as sort of the champion of communist ideas, the ways that those ideas help us to understand the international system still remains a useful approach. So if you're taking a Marxist way of approaching the international system, one of the things that you do is that you tend to view the system not as competitive or cooperative or absolute gains or relative gains, but as fundamentally exploitive, right? It's a system in which those who have power and those who have wealth use that power and wealth to exploit those who don't, and in fact siphon off wealth from those who are powerless to further enrich and entrench those in power. And that process is occurring separate from states, right? And so realist theory is very rooted in states, and liberal theory is very rooted in states and international organizations and NGOs. Marxist theory really doesn't care about states as sort of the central mechanism of international politics. Instead, it's focused on the difference between the core, which would be the industrial centers of the global economy, and the periphery, right, which would be the places in the world that produce raw materials and commodities that are going to be feeding raw materials into those core areas, and then finished goods are sort of flowing back out to the periphery. And that relationship between the core and the periphery isn't necessarily rooted in one state versus another state, or even in a handful of states. It's a global process, and Marxist theory says you have to understand that global process to understand how the system is operating. A second approach for thinking about the international system is postmodernism. And I would maybe begin by saying that when we talked about different ways to overcome the collective action problem, one of those options offered up by Goldstein Peephouse was the idea of changing identity. And I think that this maybe is a nod to postmodernism as a way of understanding how the international system works and understanding why things are the way they are. And the place to start with understanding postmodernism is that ideas have a lot of power. In fact, the way that we think about our world, or in, I guess, postmodern jargon, the way we socially construct the world, the way that collectively we all think of these things, is really important. And it's perhaps even more important than the physical world that we have. Now, on the surface, that might seem a little odd, right? You'd think that the physical world would matter a lot. But let me give you an example where we can see how ideas and that social construction maybe trumps what we would see as sort of the physical reality, right? So behind me, I have a desk. And periodically in my office, I get tired. And I could shut the door and go and take a nap on the desk. That's a possibility. However, I've never done that. And part of the reason for that is that it's weird to sleep on your desk. We sleep on couches or beds. I'd be much more likely to sleep on the floor than to sleep on a desk. It's not that a desk won't hold me. It's a sturdy desk. I can put my weight on it. It can physically handle it. But I've built up in my mind, because of my interactions with other people, that desks aren't where you sleep. That our ideas and the way that we perceive the object are more important than the physical properties of the object. And so postmodern theory is really interested in where those ideas come from, how they get retold and reworked and change over time. And a lot of that gets done through stories or ideas or narratives. And if you're thinking about that, then you might want to ask the question, why are some stories told and not others? Who controls those stories? Who's able to repeat a certain set of stories that become the way that society thinks about things, and other ideas and other sets of stories get sort of pushed to the side. And so from a postmodern story, you might look at that and say, well, what is this story doing? Why was it created? Whose interests is it serving? What work is it doing? And so we could think about a couple different examples of this, right? So one could be the realist narrative that states are the important actors in the international system because states keep people safe from the horrible, awful things in the international system, and that the state is really important and we should be grateful for the state for all the good and wonderful things that it does for us in keeping us safe. Well, that's maybe true, but it also is a story that makes people very dependent and very acquiescent toward the state. And postmodern theory would say, wow, isn't it interesting how realist scholars with their interest in the importance of the state and security keep getting all that money from the state in terms of grants and in terms of research fellowships, in terms of opportunities. They're sort of feeding resources to people who are telling a story about the international system that they like. Another example that we could see is the fact that when we tell the history of the international system, it's often a history told from the perspective of Europeans, both European states and then the colonies that they created, and then the United States coming out of that process. It's very rarely a story told from the perspective of the colonized. And that's interesting because it emphasizes the agency and the decision-making and the rationales of certain states and sort of gives them a privileged position as actors and doers in the international system. And you might look at that and say, okay, well, what is that doing in terms of allowing us to think about the international system as a place where the United States gets to do things and other states are acted upon by the United States? And then finally, I could give you an example of what gets put in IR textbooks, right? The authors are making decisions about which theories to highlight and which theories not to highlight, and people who choose IR textbooks are making decisions about which textbooks they want because they tell a certain narrative. And so for my own personal sort of approach to political science, I tend to favor sort of the realist liberal debate. I tend to favor a more scientific approach to political science, and I chose Goldstein and Peterhouse as a textbook because they do a really good job of presenting that way of thinking about international politics, right? There are other textbooks out there that focus primarily on postmodernism. I'm not a particularly big fan of this approach, and so I don't assign that textbook. And the idea is that maybe some of you will get really interested in political science the way I do political science. Maybe you'll go to graduate school and get a PhD, and then we can go and meet up at conferences and have a beer and sort of discuss political science the way I like to think about political science, right? It's a story. This whole class is a story, it's a project, and it's doing work. A third sort of grouping, I guess, of theories that Goldstein and Peterhouse talk about relate to gender and how gender operates in the international system. And so there are a variety of different feminist theories. And I actually think Goldstein and Peterhouse do a fairly good job of highlighting a couple of different ways in which this is used. And feminist theories all sort of offer a critique of the international system as it's operating, but they point to different elements about that. And so we could talk about liberal feminism, which points to the fact that women have historically been underrepresented in international politics. They've been underrepresented in the diplomatic corps, they've been underrepresented in the leadership of the state, and there's sort of a normative element of we should change that. We should bring more women into the international system, and I wonder what that will do in terms of changing how that system operates. So there's this one question about where are women at in the international system, how can their voices be elevated, and what will that mean for changing the way the international system is thought about. And one way to maybe think about why there might be change on this with bringing more women into the picture is that perhaps men and women think about international politics differently or bring a different approach. And so if we look at realist theory, for example, there's a lot of focus on states as these independent, autonomous actors that are out there doing things but aren't necessarily connected to each other. It's been argued by postmodern feminism, which is really interested in the narratives that we tell, the stories that we tell, and the work that those stories do, that's a very masculine framing of these sort of autonomous, strong, independent actors. Whereas if you were to take perhaps a more feminine approach to thinking about how the system operates, you might emphasize the connections. How are these actors related? What are they doing with each other? What does that relationship look like? And you might see a holistic, interconnected web of actors rather than this sort of isolated narrative. And that carries with it a whole host of different assumptions about how you solve problems and how you approach problems and what the point of international politics actually is. A third perspective on international politics that emphasizes ideas drawn from feminist theory is difference feminism, which looks at how we play up or down the roles that men and women play in the international system. And this is something that I've noticed pretty frequently, just reading the newspaper, I study Civil War, and so I frequently read about, massacres of villages, and oftentimes I see that phrase, women and children, and it's always framed in terms of victim. And so the implication that men are the doers and the actors in these conflicts, and women are the victims in these conflicts. And that's a particular way of valuing what men are doing and a way of what women are doing. But when you drill down into what's actually happening in some of these villages, when the Lord's Resistance Army rolls across the jungle and into a village, men flee and scatter. Women flee and scatter, but when women flee and scatter, when an invading army is coming to pillage and destroy, they take the children with them. They're out in the jungle for weeks, keeping the kids together, keeping them fed, making sure people are taken care of, holding that unit together. And then they return and they rebuild society. That's a very different story. That's a story in which women are the defenders and the protectors and the doers who are engaging in heroic, genuinely heroic activities of protecting and defending and sustaining the defenseless children. But we oftentimes frame that action as victimhood. And difference feminism would sort of poke at that and say, what's going on there? Why do we do that? Why are we valuing the running away that men oftentimes do, or the ineffective response to an invading army of grabbing your gun, but the incredibly life-sustaining efforts of women to keep children from dying in the forest or being killed off by soldiers is denigrated as just another manifestation of victimhood? I think there's value in thinking about the international system with these different approaches and these different lenses. I don't have a lot I can do with them beyond sort of throwing this on your radar and saying there are really interesting questions to be asked, but I think it's valuable if you're interested in learning more about these approaches. Goldstein Peep House have more. I can also provide more resources as requested.